Thank you all for coming, and especially for staying in this hot room for so long to listen to us. My name is Ali. On my team, I have Sala Clark, our economics expert, John Ahn, our regional relations expert, and Skylar Smith, our military expert. Some people would have you believe the we should let China become richer and stronger without regard for what they may do with their increasing power. As China B, we do not wish to retard China's growth or prevent Chinese citizens from achieving a higher standard of living. We do not wish to start a war. We simply want to think critically about the possibilities that may arise if China is not only the richest, but also the most influential actor in Asia, politically, economically, and militarily. We are encouraging you all to look at the trajectory of China's actions because we do not live in a static world. We don't think China is going to attack the US or Japan tomorrow, but we are interested in playing the long game to ensure that our position 30 years from now is stable. A stable position in a few decades would look very similar to today, but that is not the direction that China is aiming for. China currently sees the US as weak and in decline, and therefore unstable. To China, this is a great opportunity to balance the power of the US and ultimately become the regional hegemon in Asia, a role it perceives as its rightful position. This would present instability and threats not only to the US, but to the security of surrounding nations, many of which are our allies. Especially following our financial crisis in 2008, which appeared to Beijing as proof of our imminent decline, China has seen this as an opportunity to balance to become more assertive, particularly in the South and East China Seas. Although it is not in China's best interest to publicly reveal their intentions, China is trying to exclude us, pressure neighbors, and settle border disputes unilaterally. It is in the best interest of the US to recognize how China currently perceives its position in the world, the actions they've taken, and see that China's long-term goals may be incompatible with our interests. China would like to replace the United States as the primary strategic actor in Asia. This means that instead of asking, what would the US think before taking an action, an Asian country like South Korea would ask, what would China think? This includes weakening the US alliance system and undermining the confidence of Asian nations in US credibility and reliability. They would like to use economic power to pull Asian nations closer to Beijing's geopolitical policy preferences and cast doubt on our economic model. Following a small setback to their rise, like the recent stock market crash, China's leaders turned to strong nationalism to reinforce their legitimacy, but they capitalize on our own economic crisis to make us look weak. Finally, we are concerned that China's rising economy is resulting in increased militarization and taking resources and territory in the region as they see fit. In 2010, China's foreign minister said, "China is a big country, other countries are small, and that is just a fact." Just last year, China moved an oil rig into Vietnam's territory, causing clashes with local fishermen. This is just one example of China's increasing disregard and dissatisfaction with territorial claims. Our policy recommendations also come at a great time because we currently do not have a crisis at hand, but China's current actions, while not necessarily threatening by themselves, may lead to a situation down the road where China becomes the only dominant country in Asia and calls all the shots. This is against our interests because our allies don't want Chinese dominance, yet they are dwarfed by China's economic and military power. They expect the US to help them resist China. Otherwise, they will view an alliance with the US as unreliable and less valuable. We also benefit from our economic power in the region and our relationships in the region, a status that will be somewhat lost with a power transition. Our presence as a leader has allowed for unprecedented levels of cooperation among major powers and peace in the region. A forceful transition will cause more tension and conflicts that will not benefit other actors in the region, especially not the United States. For example, China could monopolize sea lanes and prevent us and other countries from benefiting from the free trade and property rights that we help to maintain. So we need a strategy to preserve American values and interests in the face of any threats a rising China might present our country, while not decreasing the benefits that both countries enjoy from peace in Asia and a prosperous trade relationship. The deterrence part of our strategy means we prevent China from crossing red lines that we've deemed most important. My colleagues will address these specifically. The versatility aspect of our policy comes from our willingness to scale down aggression on our part in return for China meeting our requests. This policy leaves room for mutually beneficial cooperation and overlapping interests in the future. We also leave room for appropriate economic success that does not directly feed militarization and territorial aggression, so China can become a more responsible stakeholder internationally. A strategy of versatile deterrence is better than a passive policy of concessions and damaging agreements. It is also not exposed to extremely negative downsides or risks, the way a strategy of only pursuing diplomacy is. In addition, our allies are on the same page and want our involvement. Finally, acting now prevents a crisis later and puts us in a stronger negotiating position in the future. We have specific policies designed to balance China as its power rises. First, John will discuss how China has disrupted our allies, as well as where we must draw the line against China's aggressive actions.
Thank you, Ali. Using its vast military and economic power, China has disrupted its neighbors and our regional allies in two main ways. First, with territorial disputes, and second, with economic aggression. China's dispute with Japan in the East China Sea has become one of the most pressing geopolitical flashpoints in East Asia, after Tokyo Governor Shintaro Ishihara proposed to buy the Senkaku-Daiyu Islands from their private Japanese owner. Protests were triggered across China, and Chinese government ships have regularly sailed in territorial waters around the islands as a response. This issue has inflamed ethnic tensions on both sides, as well as furthering Japanese fears of Chinese aggression. In fact, Chinese aggression has spooked Japanese Prime Minister Abe's cabinet to the point where they sacrificed a lot of political capital to push through deeply unpopular legislation, rewriting Japan's constitution, giving them greater military defense powers. This legislation drastically expands Japan's defense powers by giving the Japanese military the ability to provide the United States with logistical support and even provide armed backup in international conflicts. Thus, our red line in this instance is that China must not invade the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. Another major source of regional tension is Taiwan, which China has repeatedly declared sovereignty over. Chinese communist leadership seeks to maintain its legitimacy in order to prevent potential uprisings. In the interest of preserving its legitimacy and satisfying the nationalist populace, Chinese leaders are willing to have military action to prevent Taiwan from formally declaring independence. Although relations between Taiwan and China are peaceful at the moment, there is still potential for conflict. Pro-Chinese Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou is leaving office next year, and a new wave of anti-Chinese sentiment has pushed presidential hopeful Tsai Ing-wen in the lead for opinion polls, who belongs to the pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party and may explicitly express a formal declaration of Taiwanese independence. Thus, our red line in this instance is that China must not invade Taiwan. Finally, one of the most contentious areas of China's territorial aggression with its neighbors is in the South China Sea. Chinese ships tried to deploy an oil rig in waters claimed by Vietnam. Chinese ships intentionally rammed two Vietnamese Sea Guard vessels and sought to intimidate them. Additionally, China has competing claims with the Philippines and Vietnam over the Spratly and Paracel archipelagos, mainly in interest of potential oil and gas reserves. Vietnam has responded by starting to build a military and economic relationship with the United States. Just recently, highly ranked official Nguyen Phu Trong became the first Vietnamese Party General Secretary to visit the United States. On defense and security, Trong called on the United States and Vietnam to expand their cooperation on law enforcement, counterterrorism, and most importantly, maritime security. Nguyen spoke at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in D.C., urging Washington to assist Vietnam's defense needs by supplying vessels for maritime security and collaborating with gas and oil exploration. Thus, our red line is that China must not invade the Spratly and Paracel archipelagos. China has also used economic aggression in a way that has disrupted our regional relations. In the instance of South Korea, the two economies have become increasingly intertwined, with China overtaking the United States as South Korea's largest trading partner. Recently, China and South Korea signed a free trade agreement, with China promising to abolish tariffs on 91% of all South Korean goods. South Korea has had a mixed response. Although they have been towards China's side, they have recently joined China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This brings a large economic interdependence danger, because China may use its economic power to bully and blackmail South Korea into following policies designed by the PRC. However, we still have an ability. Oh, and they also rejected THAAD, which Sala will cover later. Additionally, there is public mistrust. According to polls conducted by the Asia Research Institute, South Koreans rank the issue of China's continued rise and South Korea's increasing dependency on China's economy high on the list of potential security threats to South Korea. It is this mistrust of Chinese interests that the United States should capitalize upon to strengthen our alliance with the ROK. With Taiwan, we see a similar scenario. China is Taiwan's largest trading partner, with 40% of Taiwanese exports directed towards the mainland. The response has been that the Taiwanese President Ma Ying-jeou has signed several trade agreements with China, but we find a similar situation in which this makes them vulnerable to Chinese control. In fact, the National Defense Research Institute stated that Beijing has either committed or publicly contemplated many forms of economic pressure against Taiwan at various times within the past 2 decades, openly proclaiming that its key goals for expanding economic ties with Taiwan include using business to pressure politicians. Also, Chinese leaders have repeatedly expressed using economic ties to reunify Taiwan in many ways, from the magnetic to the highly coercive. Also with Southeast Asia, China has successfully added Southeast Asian countries such as Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand to the AIIB, and it may also use its economic influence and investment to exert Chinese control. Thus, our red line in this instance is China must not use its deep economic ties with other countries to coerce them into following Beijing's desired geopolitical policies. In general, the United States must respond by strengthening our military and economic ties with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, as well as forging new military and economic ties with potential allies in Southeast Asia. Skylar, in addition to addressing Chinese military aggression, will explain how we will deter China from crossing the red lines of territorial disputes in the East China Sea, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. Sala, in addition to addressing direct economic threats China poses to the US, will explain how we will deter China from crossing the red line of economic manipulation. So now Sala will talk about the economy.
Thank you, John. So, many of you may be wondering, how exactly is China an economic threat to the United States? First, I would like to say that China has a long history of economic aggression, and there's no reason to think that this will change in the future. As for how this looks in practice, I'll first start with predatory pricing. The best example of this is solar panels. The Chinese government gives their solar panel companies long-term loans with incredibly low interest rates, so that they can sell the panels for less than it costs to produce them. China is purposefully undercutting the market in order to destroy American businesses. Once they have a monopoly, China would be able to raise the prices as high as they want. While solar panels might seem like a small issue on their own, there is no reason for China not to extend this practice into other markets, and there is evidence they have already begun to do so with rare earth minerals. Next, we have currency manipulation. China is well known for purposefully devaluing their own currency in order to obtain a trade advantage. China also uses its economic strength to bully smaller countries into doing what it wants. An example of this is when South Korea rejected the installation of the THAAD missile defense system, which the US had been requesting them to install. This was due to Chinese economic pressure and not due to any reluctance of the Koreans. As for how China intends to gain economic dominance, I will continue. So, China's rate of GDP growth was 7.4% in 2014, compared to the US's 2.4%. This will allow them to do more of what they're already doing, unless the United States takes action to prevent it now. While some of you may be wondering about China's recent stock market slump, this is actually just a road bump. China recovered quickly after the 2008 crisis, and there's no reason to think that they won't do the same thing again. As you heard from Ali, China is attempting to use its economic strength to gain regional dominance. They will attempt to push the United States out of Asia so that they can further their own interests to the detriment of our own. This can be seen in their creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, which would give loans for infrastructure to developing countries in Asia. This is a direct attack against U.S. ally Japan, which has led the Asian Development Bank since its founding. As the ADB has essentially the same role as the AIIB, the only reason for China to create this bank was to give itself more economic control, with less room for other countries to have a say. China is also currently trying to convince the IMF to accept the yuan as an international reserve currency. If it is successful, other countries would be more interested in using the yuan as part of their official reserves, increasing China's global economic power. It would also pull more investment into China and could make investors sell their dollars for yuan, causing inflation in the United States and the weakening of the dollar worldwide. However, Chinese and American ties make our ability to complicate our ability to combat China directly. 40% of the world's trade passes through the South China Sea. If China increased its navy, then they could halt trade and damage the United States economy. China also owns a large amount of U.S. Treasury bonds, which they could dump into the market in order to devalue the dollar. However, it is unlikely that China could do this fast enough to avoid devaluing the rest of their U.S. debt. In essence, trying to fight China using economics directly would be like using a double-edged sword. We can't attack them without also hurting ourselves. So what should we do? We need to limit Chinese economic control in Asia and the world, especially with U.S. allies and potential allies, while we still can. How do we do this? We need to make the ADB more appealing to use than the AIIB. It needs to have bigger reserves, and it needs to be easier for developing countries to get loans. We need to oppose the yuan becoming a reserve currency by pointing out its instability as compared to the three current reserve currencies, the dollar, the pound, and the euro. We need to demand more accurate currency valuations, and this is one of our red lines. We need to form an agreement with other countries so that if China refuses to comply, we can buy the new yuan China releases into the market so that we can hold its value steady. Most importantly, we need to create and strengthen trade deals with our allies and potential allies. This will deter China from crossing the red line of bullying other countries. We should encourage South Korea and Japan to form a trade agreement with each other, something they don't already have, so that they can be more independent of China. We should also help create simpler to navigate regulations for trade in Southeast Asia, so that South Korea and Japan can more easily trade with them, which would reduce their dependence on China. The U.S. should sign a bilateral investment agreement with Taiwan to resolve and discuss barriers to trade and investment, spurring economic investment flows to Taiwan and strengthening our relationship. This would help Taiwan protect itself and deter China from crossing that red line. Similar policies have proven successful before. For example, the United States helped Yugoslavia become financially independent from the USSR control during the Cold War. So before I conclude, I would like to point out that one of the most alarming aspects of economic growth is the ability it gives China to put more money into military development. In the future, China will be able to pour more money into weapons technology and onto fielding larger and more powerful military force. Next, Skylar will talk to you about the Chinese military.
Thank you, Sala. All right, so China's role in Sino-American military relations has been largely characterized by Chinese military modernization, a lack of transparency in the Chinese administration, as well as increasing acts of regional aggression. These qualities and trends beg that U.S. foreign policy address the real threat that China poses. Now, we do not necessarily believe that these things will cause China to replace the U.S. as the dominant power in Asia tomorrow. Rather, we think that these qualities and trends of China's assertiveness and military growth suggest a future trajectory in which China may increasingly challenge U.S. military supremacy and U.S. strategic interests in, say, 25 years. Thus, our foreign strategy towards China aims to prevent it from pursuing such a trajectory. As in line with our proposed strategy of versatile deterrence, we will do so by developing policies aimed at deterring China from crossing red lines that we define as unacceptable. China's recent military growth and modernization stems from China's increasing ability to spend money on national defense because of its rapidly growing economy. As the second largest economy in the world, according to nominal GDP, China has been able to sustain an annual average increase in defense spending of 9.5% for the past decade. Increases in military spending are going towards the development and proliferation of China's naval forces, its aircraft carrier programs, its armed drones, submarines, nuclear weapons, and cyber warfare and anti-satellite technologies. In particular, China has increasingly invested in weapons that can perform long-range attacks, as well as ground-launched offensive missiles. While as little as 10 years ago, China had so-called rudimentary capabilities to strike locations beyond the first island chain in the South and East China Seas, today China has funded the creation of enough missiles and other weapons to target all 23 U.S. bases in Japan, as well as more remote bases such as Guam. In many ways, China confirms that this is in fact their intention by presenting these military developments as instruments through which it can bolster its anti-access area denial, known as A2AD programs, which are explicitly aimed at deterring so-called third parties in what China sees as purely regional conflicts. To make matters worse, Chinese military modernization has been accompanied by a severe lack of transparency from the Chinese administration regarding military spending, military capabilities, and its intentions. This lack of transparency largely manifests itself in underreported defense spending figures, which some analysts contend underestimate actual figures by as much as 35%. Additionally, an example of China's suspicious intentions was when China in 2014 sent submarines into the Indian Ocean and claimed that they were for counter-piracy objectives, while several reports contend that China was instead conducting area familiarization in order to further project its power in the region. Not only has China increased the quantity and improved the quality of its military forces while also failing to clearly communicate its intentions, China has also become much more aggressive and assertive in character, especially regarding regional disputes over territorial claims. It has greatly increased the number of patrols and exercises it performs in the South and East China Seas, and has performed low-intensity coercion with the use of the Chinese Coast Guard and Navy ships belonging to the People's Liberation Army. As this figure depicts, these actions are not only largely motivated by historical claims, but also by rising nationalism in China. While we recognize that this type of military growth is, in some ways, a natural result of a growing economy, and while we also accept that it is completely rational for China to want to expand its military and to also want to assume a greater role of influence in Asia, the purposes for which China is using these additional military capabilities and the trend that this growth may suggest could jeopardize the future of the U.S.'s favorable foothold in Asia. Although these developments do not threaten U.S. military primacy and will not come close to doing so anytime soon, these developments threaten almost all of our allies in the region and subsequently still serve as threats to our strategic interests. At some level of Chinese aggression, if we fail to intervene in such a case where an ally needs our support, or if we are increasingly unable to intervene due to developing A2AD developments, our ally would no longer see the U.S. as a reliable ally nor a credible protector, thus damaging diplomatic relations abroad. Our ally will then have more incentive to increase its own military forces for the purpose of self-defense, which will in turn also create more incentive for other neighboring countries to also increase their military forces. In an even worse case, these interrelated security dilemmas might potentially inspire these countries in the Asia-Pacific region to desire nuclear weapons if they see them as essential to protecting their interests. Therefore, the best course of action for the U.S. is to develop a foreign policy that combats the harmful effects that Chinese military modernization, its lack of transparency, and increasing aggression may have directly on U.S. capabilities in Asia and also our allies' capability in that region. We deem it unacceptable for China to use its A2AD capabilities to attack U.S. forces or bases in Asia, and our policy proposals aims to deter China from crossing such a red line that would ultimately necessitate an immediate and powerful use of U.S. forces in response. We also believe it unacceptable for Chinese regional aggression to progress to the point where China takes another disputed island or major sea lane. Our military proposal is also aimed at deterring China from crossing this red line that would again necessitate the immediate use of military forces. We will deter China from crossing these two red lines by strengthening our regional partnerships and building new alliances, such as with Vietnam. To do this, we propose we begin conducting military exercises with Vietnam, especially in the South China Sea, and that we also eliminate the lethal weapons ban that the U.S. has imposed on Vietnam. Second, we will also deter China from crossing these two red lines by strengthening our military forces at U.S. bases in and around the Asia-Pacific region in order to deter acts of aggression towards ourselves or allies and to also decrease our response time to such acts of aggression. Specifically, this plan would include increasing the number of ground-launched missiles at our bases, as well as anti-ship missiles that could be positioned at choke points along and near the first island chain for the purposes of containing PLA Navy ships to that region. Now, our strategy is not just one simply of deterrence. It is one of versatile deterrence. In other words, we are willing to give concessions regarding our deterring acts if China is also willing to give concessions. In this case, we would scale back our military efforts in this region, including our new military exercises with Vietnam and our strengthened U.S. bases, if China is willing to, say, increase their transparency regarding military spending or drop certain regional territorial disputes. Now, note that we also have limitations with this. If our allies provoke any conflicts, such as if Taiwan declares independence, we will withdraw all military support. This will prevent our allies from taking advantage of us and from taking risks that they would not otherwise take. Given the imminent election or potential election of a pro-independent president in Taiwan in 2016, we will have to make this explicitly clear and perhaps arrange a meeting to communicate this as soon as he may take office. Now I'll turn it over to Ali, who will present us with a conclusion.
Thank you, Skylar. So, we have presented a strategy of versatile deterrence to counterbalance an increasingly assertive China and preserve our interests in Asia for the decades to come. Like Japan, we should be looking at the trajectory of China's actions and preparing ourselves to respond to the possibility that some of China's aspirations are incompatible with peace, stability, security, and not sitting on our heels hoping for the best. We cannot allow China to take other countries' territories by force. They also must not economically manipulate other countries into geopolitical policies or engage in currency devaluations. While our current policies already do some of this, to deter China, we should support the Asian Development Bank by making it more appealing than the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, oppose the yuan becoming a reserve currency, demand accurate currency valuations, strengthen economic ties, strengthen military bases, and engage in military exercises with Vietnam. If China backs down how we intend, we are in a good position for negotiations in areas of shared interest going forward. We can also scale back on more aggressive policies that we implement now to persuade China how we want it to in the future, to act how we want it to in the future, such as increase their military transparency. In sum, we will deter China from using their increasingly successful economy to militarize, bully neighbors, and disrupt the stability of the region, but not prevent them from developing and increasing the standard of living of their 1.4 billion people. The long-term benefits of this strategy far outweigh the costs. Defense spending can be below pre-9/11 levels without mitigating U.S. engagement, and we gain a stronger negotiating platform while we can. We need to be certain that we do not get trapped in a situation where China calls the shots, other countries are solely dependent on China, and we aren't able to balance their dominance or respond to any threats in the future. Thank you.
Okay, couple questions. One, you stressed, this is for Skylar, you stressed that you want to decrease the risk of security dilemmas among allies, but it appears you're doing that at the risk of escalating security dilemmas between the United States and China. Second question for whoever wants it. You guys draw a lot of red lines, and so one problem with that is China will feel encircled with a lot of red paint. Some of these things you would be risking a U.S.-China standoff over barren rocks. Kind of hard to get American support for that sort of thing if they struggle over things like Syria. But to steal Dan Altman's very good argument, another problem with red lines is the ambiguity in them. So how do you respond to, say, economic building on the Spratlys or the Paracels, which are not an attempt at overt conquest? You can call it peaceful development, come up with a euphemism. But how do you deal with ambiguity in your red lines? Over to you.
So our policy is largely focused on versatile deterrence. That's kind of the whole message. And so our aim is to deter China from continuing to develop its military, which it appears is doing kind of anyway. And so you talk about potentially starting a security dilemma between the U.S. and China, and I argue that China is going to continue developing its military unless we do something to stop it, and there's no diplomatic arrangements are not going to be effective in doing this. The only thing that China will respond to is deterrence.
Right.
And
So yeah,
If you
do you
want
want to
to
take
go.
another one? Or?
I can take some of the red lines. Okay. So in regards to the ambiguity of red lines, I think it's that when we can easily make a distinction of when China crosses the red line, especially with the rocks. So right now, Japan has a lot of defense ships encircling the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. The only way for China to install like an economic platform would be to physically break through the Japanese defense barrier. That would be an active invasion, so that distinction can easily be made. And the same distinction can be made with the Spratly and Paracel archipelagos.
Thank you. Good answer.
So I just wanted to add something as well, is that we're not trying to contain China in the way that we would contain a Cold War Soviet Union, because we are not trying to force them into an economic crisis, and we are leaving them room for appropriate economic advancement. So hopefully you can, sorry, I didn't mean to keep you, you can leave if you want to. But I think if we ask the same thing of an alternate policy, but if China continues to do what it's doing, without our acting like this, then we're in an even worse position than we are now. So it's not that we're acting aggressive towards China, but we want to be ready for them to act aggressive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. A couple of questions, which in some ways ask you to unpack a little bit of the mechanisms beyond what you did here. One of the first ones is, one of your red lines is about currency devaluation. In other words, allowing the yuan to actually rise in accordance with the markets. How do you do this? This is something the United States has attempted to do for years. It's been complaining about the status of the yuan for decades. So what magic wand is the United States now deploying that makes this happen?
Right. So, yeah, that's true that we have talked about devaluation for a long time, but that we've never actually been able to do anything specifically about it. And so our new proposal would suggest that we form a coalition with many other countries around the world who presumably also have a problem with this. Nobody likes their imports into China looking more expensive. And so together, once China releases new yuan into the market, which is how they devalue their currency now, they used to peg it to the dollar, now they just release a lot of currency, we would just buy all of that new currency immediately, and then it wouldn't have time to circulate and change the value.
Okay. So this is funny because this actually then ties into my next question, because it adds, one of the things I was surprised to hear at the end is the fact that not only do we have this great new policy, it's that it's costless. Right? You actually said something about military defense, 9/11 levels, all of these. So I want to hear about the costs of this. Doing something like buying all you want, that's a costly policy. Setting up new alliances, unless they are paper alliances, that's a costly policy. Putting out new bases, these are costly policies, right? How exactly, A, is the United States justifying these costly policies? And B, I'm curious as to how we're paying for these costly policies.
So I wish I could remember the specific source that I read that from, but I can look it up in my notes. But so it's not costless. We're not trying to say that it won't cost anything, but I think we're emphasizing that we want to add more to Obama's already existing pivot towards Asia. So that does in some way imply that we will be spending less in other areas of the world in order to treat China as one of our most important situations that we have now.
Yeah. Also, to add on to that, as we're winding down operations in Afghanistan and also potentially Iraq, we find that a lot of our military costs in other areas, like Ali mentioned, have decreased. So overall, we're not going to see a large upshoot of military costs because in the end, it's not going to be a full-scale invasion like we saw in the Middle East. So we're not going to see a super large increase in cost.
As for buying the yuan, yeah, that would be expensive, but presumably it would be spread across many countries. That's the main reason for the agreement. However, the fact that China devalues its currency, it decreases our imports into that country, making us lose money that way. So once the yuan has a better value, then it would increase our imports into China and increase our revenues to the United States, somewhat balancing that out.
Oh, and one more thing. As to how we're justified in having these military costs. As we mentioned before, there's a huge potential for a security dilemma, instability in the region. If this happens, not only could we be potentially drawn into a military conflict, but should we even back off from a potential military conflict, our economy would still be irreparably harmed because we're so interconnected with China, South Korea, Japan, and many Asian markets. And also we have justification because we need to defend our allies. So it's in our self-interest and in our allies' self-interest.
I think it's also in our self-interest economically to deal with these aggressions on China's part now, rather than down the road, where I think the red lines we might draw down the road would be even harder and more expensive to keep them behind.
Excellent. I thought it was a great presentation, and I think a positive sign is that you guys really got your message across about the red lines, because my first question is also about the red lines, so that hit home. Building off of what Joe and Stacy said, I agree with you on being able to draw clear red lines on something like territorial invasion. I'm a little bit less clear about how you do that on things like using economic ties to get a country to support what you're trying to do. I mean, in a first case, that's kind of the basis of politics. The United States does that all the time. So I'm okay with the fact that you can say the U.S. is okay doing that. We don't want China to do that. But also, how do you know that when you see it, and what exactly is going to be your response? Because again, you don't just draw the red lines. You have to be ready to enforce something in response to that. So the territorial one makes a lot more sense and is a lot more clear to me than kind of the using economic ties to get influence one. So could you talk about that one a bit more?
Well, the interesting thing about the economic one, especially with South Korea, is this was originally part of John's section, but it migrated to mine after the dry runs, was that China directly told South Korea, don't install these or we will stop trading with you. Like, they didn't try to hide that at all. It was very obvious what they were doing. And so in situations like that, we can certainly decide that they had crossed a red line, I think.
Right. So that's a really good way of identifying whether or not China has crossed a red line. And also, as I pointed out with the case of Taiwan, like Chinese leaders explicitly stated that they wanted economic ties to have political influence. As to our response, it's a bit less coercive than with territorial aggression. So like Sala stated with her policy proposals, we would try to make sure that we wean off our allies' economic reliance on China. So right now, Japan and South Korea, they don't have a free trade agreement, but they are they're some of the biggest economies in the region, and they would definitely benefit from trade with each other. If the United States could somehow foster that relationship and remove ethnic tensions in a way, then we would be able to make sure that they would have less of their exports directed towards China. And also, in a way, although this policy response is a bit more peaceful, it also has an indirect negative effect on China because the less exports directed towards Beijing means more exports directed towards Tokyo or Jakarta or other Southeast Asian countries. So that would harm Chinese markets as well.
Excellent. My other question is, there's one thing that seemed a little jarring in your presentation where you said, maybe it was you, Skylar, that we didn't want allies to mobilize or to kind of, have increased arms or arms expenditures, in part because of the security dilemma issue. But it would seem to me that if you wanted that, that would help with Professor Goddard's point about how this would be less costly to the American people. But also the fact that if we're talking about maybe a defense-dominant world where it's easier to kind of defend territory than take it, then the fact that you have U.S. allies in the region spending a bit more on their military defense versus what China would have to do to then keep up with that. If they had the same level of spending, that wouldn't really do it. They would have to really go up to an even higher level. That could actually be a potential weakening for them. I mean, along the lines of how the pro-Reagan supporters in the U.S. like to talk about the end of the Cold War, but even if you're not a supporter of Reagan in that regard, just the sense that I'm not entirely sure why increased spending by allies or increased commitment of allies to these same issues is a negative from the U.S. perspective. I would see that as being somewhat complementary to what you're trying to do. So could you tell me a little bit more about that?
So I would just first address, so yes, increased military spending. The one of the fears we had with that was that those other countries we would not be protecting them as much. They would have to provide for some of their own defenses, and in such a case with a rise in China that clearly has way more military force than they do, they might want to desire stronger forces, and perhaps in terms of nuclear weapons, which is obviously something we don't want as one of our broader goals of nuclear non-proliferation. So I think that's one of the smaller fears of that.
Right. And building off of Skylar's point, another thing that we pointed out during the presentation was not necessarily that we don't want our allies to increase their defense spendings at all. It's just we need to make sure they're not independently increasing their defenses. So we need to make sure that the United States is overseeing all of these defense areas, and we need to have collaboration, because the danger of the security dilemma is when we have all of these different actors such as South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan independently developing their own defense operations and abilities. That increases uncertainty and the possibility of conflict. And one of the big impacts of us not stepping in and increasing our defenses to reassure our allies is, again, the nuclear proliferation point. And I think that's probably the biggest impact of having an unchecked China, because many countries, like South Korea, explicitly stated like a couple decades ago that they wanted to have the nuclear bomb. But the United States intervened, they guaranteed their security, and that's why they aren't having nuclear weapons. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen, because with more countries having more nuclear weapons, that increases the chance of conflict.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, China Team B.